This video is sponsored by Movie Palette.
Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Henry Golding plays a deadly game of Hitman vs. Hitman in Assassin's Club. Morgan, played by Henry Golding, is a top-notch assassin, unbeknownst to his teacher girlfriend Sophie, played by Daniela Malchior, who he wants to retire with. But Morgan's handler Caldwell, played by Sam Neill, has one last job for him: 6 targets, $1 million each. The catch is that the targets are all other assassins, each with the same contracts, creating a deadly game where the only way that Morgan can survive is to find out why they've been pitted against each other and to keep on killing. If you haven't heard of Assassin's Club, I don't blame you. It's a European indie action film directed by Camille Delamare, who previously worked extensively for Luc Besson's EuropaCorp, including as an editor on Taken 2 and Columbiana, and as a director on Brick Mansions and The Transporter Refueled. Assassin's Club was picked up by Paramount in a number of territories, including the US and the UK, and for some reason they decided to give it a full-blown theatrical release over here, presumably because of the cast involved, although they did so with virtually no publicity whatsoever, no press screenings for critics, and in some cinemas only screening in very limited time slots. In one cinema's case, I found it was showing at just 10 o'clock at night. Needless to say, the film was a complete bust at the box office, not even breaking the top 10, and was out of cinemas in literally a week. The fact that Paramount hardly even let people know this even existed should tell you just how highly they thought of it, and if you need even further proof, in the US, this isn't even getting a theatrical release at all, not even a token one. It's just getting dumped out on VOD, despite that cast list. That should be a big red flag, and you should definitely observe those warning signs, because Assassin's Club is a train wreck. A few years ago, after Crazy Rich Asians, Henry Golding was supposed to be the next big thing. He was handsome, he was charming, he was charismatic, he was clearly leading man material, and yet I don't think the industry quite knows what to do with him. All the roles that he's taken since then have underperformed, either critically or commercially, with a big career dent in the form of Snake Eyes, which admittedly wasn't really his fault so much as the franchise it was attached to. But man, whoever talked him into appearing in Assassin's Club, it'll be like your James Bond audition tape, needs to be given the sack immediately. Golding perhaps needs some new management if this is the best that he's being offered. In fact, Paramount might actually be doing Golding a favour by not promoting the film, because if I was him, I would be like Al Pacino at the end of Jack and Jill. This must never be seen by anybody. It's one thing to appear in a bad movie, those happen all the time. It's another to appear in something that's genuinely embarrassing, the kind of film that tarnishes the reputation of virtually everyone involved with it because it makes them look grossly incompetent. It's the kind of film that could potentially kill someone's career if it comes at the wrong time. And Golding is not a terrible actor. I've seen him in things where he's been really good, but Assassin's Club is one of those films that puts his shortcomings front and centre, and I don't think this is entirely his fault. This is largely to do with the direction, because there are several major actors in this film that give perhaps some of the worst performances they've ever given in front of a camera, but Golding looks especially lost being at the centre of it all. He looks really adrift, it makes a complete misuse of his talents and abilities, and he seems remarkably stiff. He just kind of falls into a robotic action hero pose, except when he's called upon to be angry, at which point he goes into like 110% overacting, which is really quite bewildering. I feel like Golding is trying way too hard to compensate for the script. He knows it's a bad script and is trying to sell it by going really full force with his acting, and instead it's just dragging him down alongside it. Golding clearly wants to show himself as a viable action star, but if he keeps making movies like this, he's not going to be headlining A-list blockbusters, he's going to be making a beeline into the direct-to-video hellhole, and the guy should be in the prime of his career. He's in his mid-30s, but this is a very dangerous time for him, because if he ends up getting stuck doing direct-to-video action fodder, That's very hard to break out of again, and he deserves much better than that. The script for this is atrocious. It's credited to Thomas Dunn, who is the film's producer, which no doubt explains why it arrives on screen in the sorry state that it does, because no one's going to be asking the producer for rewrites to his own script. And if you look at his IMDb page, you'll realise that he hasn't really worked on a movie of this kind of scale before. A lot of his previous writing credits are on low-budget horror films, which explains why he's so massively out of his depth. And this genuinely reminded me of mid-noughties Steven Seagal direct-to-video movies, in that it starts out in a kind of coherent place, if somewhat derivative, and then, through a succession of increasingly preposterous twists, becomes completely nigh on incomprehensible. And the more it goes on, the less sense any of it makes, and you would think, given the premise of the movie, that would be surefire, if you excuse the pun. There have been loads of movies about assassins going up against one another. You think of John Wick, or The Tournament, or Smoking Aces. We've seen that plenty of times before. It's the kind of concept where, if you just do it properly, the movie kind of makes itself. Assassin's Club, however, manages to screw up even the basic premise of the film, because in actuality, half the assassins involved in the club aren't even really aware of what's going on in the movie. Several of them are either imprisoned or retired. The premise practically gives you a conveyor belt of fight scenes with cat and mouse tension, but the film forgets to give any of the other assassins characterization aside from Rapace's Falk and Golding's Morgan. So that means they just largely show up for their action scene and are almost immediately dispatched, which is a complete waste of the premise. The only time it seems to do anything interesting with the other assassins is that one of them happens to be retired with a child. He used to be a poisoner and then he got out of the game completely. There's kind of this moral quandary hanging over this sequence, whether it's right to kill him, is he actually tricking him? It deserves to be in a much better movie. It's a good idea, stranded in terrible writing. Largely, though, in execution, it seems like an attempt to just brazenly do the farmhouse sequence from the Bourne Identity. And trust me, not the first thing it steals from the Bourne movies. It's the kind of film that actively punishes you for trying to follow it, because the more you do, the more you start realising that absolutely nothing on screen makes any sense. Like, there's an early scene where Morgan and Sophie are going out for a day, and they're attacked by an assassin posing as a homeless person, and Morgan is completely oblivious to this at first. He doesn't spot his cover, so he walks past him, and that means the assassin could easily just get up and shoot him in the back from several yards away. Instead, what he actually does is inexplicably walk up behind him and point his gun 2 inches away from his neck. What kind of assassin would ever do that? I genuinely thought he was going to attack him with a knife, because of course that would make sense for him to attack him in close quarters, but instead no, he just wastes that perfectly good advantage so that Morgan can instantly disarm him because he's practically breathing down his neck. It's that kind of thing that litters all over Assassin's Club. In another action scene, Morgan confronts another assassin in an empty warehouse, and then police swarm around the building. So Golding jumps out of an exploding window and lands on one of the police cars below, but thankfully for him, all the police have swarmed into the building. No one apparently decided to stay around with the vehicles just in case he went out that way, which allows him to just casually walk over and steal an ambulance to make his escape, which leads into an awful car chase where he crashes through a bridge and then jumps out of the side while it's falling into the river and shoot a tank that makes it explode, which is one of those moments that I think is trying to be cool, but actually just looks really stupid. And then we get the central mystery as to why all these hitmen have been pitted against each other, which just made my brain hurt. On one level, it's very obvious what's happening, because the film opens with a prologue where a young girl sees her father being assassinated, so you know it has something to do with that, but then the movie takes 80 minutes to actually circle back around to that plot point. In fact, I spent great chunks of Assassin's Club going, well, when is that prologue actually going to factor into anything? And then when it does, it's some gobbledygook about now that she's grown up, she's working for a corrupt politician uncle and she wants revenge in some way because he's implicated with the assassination. This has barely been in the movie at all before this point, and then she gets duped by another character, which was about the point where I realised that I didn't understand why anything was happening on screen anymore, and also this is so astronomically stupid and so absurdly convoluted that it requires half the characters in the movie to be idiots. And then we have Nui Rapace's performance as Assassin Folk, and Rapace's one of those performers that, again, I don't think anyone's really known what to do with her, so she's been stuck in these kind of movies for quite some time, but her performance in this is absolutely bizarre. I mean, at least she's having fun with it, I guess. Folk actually has a double identity because she's actually moonlighting as a high-ranking official of international police, because you can't call it Interpol, called Agent Voss, and Voss is tasked with capturing the hitmen, so essentially Folk/Voss is tasked with trying to capture herself. It's a perfect cover. No one would possibly suspect her with being a world-renowned hitman. She works for international police. It's genius, if you don't really think about it for any stretch of time whatsoever. And when Folk assumes her hitman identity, she puts on this blonde wig and these horror movie contact lenses with really dilated pupils. They give her a kind of monstrous appearance, which is really amplified in several scenes where the character is shot in bright neon lighting, and the movie seems to be playing this as some kind of twist. There's a moment where she kind of pulls out her disguise at her job, and the movie plays a stinger sound effect, like the audience wasn't supposed to have worked out that they're both played by the same actor and are meant to be the same person switching between identities. I mean, I know the movie is casually underestimating the intelligence of the audience the entire time, but seriously, are they trying to also underestimate our eyesight? We know what Nui Rapace looks like. Rapace's accent is particularly odd. I know that English is not her first language, but she's been able to hold an accent in English-speaking roles before, so I really don't know what has happened here, because her accent does some weird transatlantic tour throughout the movie, and not just from scene to scene, but sometimes from line to line. Like a lot of the film, she has that kind of clipped English accent that she adopted for Prometheus, and then it kind of drifts somewhere closer to her native Swedish accent, but then there are other lines that sounds like she's adopting this southern drawl. Like, is the character from Texas all of a sudden? What is happening here? And the character is treated like a slasher movie villain because she refuses to die. There's a moment where the character takes a defibrillator to the chest and survives. Of course, it also helps that in this movie, none of the assassins decide to shoot their victims in the head, just to make sure they're dead. And then we get into Sam Neill, who is clearly taking a paycheck here because it definitely wasn't the script that brought him in, but I'd imagine that he only filmed his role in about 2 days because most of his scenes occur in the one location. He plays Caldwell, who is Morgan's handler, and he knows that this script is a pile of poo and adjusts his performance accordingly. So he just absolutely hams it up with a ridiculous British accent. It's kind of implied that he's a kind of military type, hiring out assassins from that background and training them, but he's got a bit privileged with all the money he's been receiving from the hits. So there's a scene where Morgan expresses his intent to retire. "I'm out." To which Caldwell responds, "Well, I'm out too. Of soy sauce," which is genuinely the only intentional laugh that I had in the entire movie, and it was only because of Neil's delivery of that absolutely horrendous line of dialogue. Neil spends half of the movie reciting exposition. He's constantly talking about the CVs of the other assassins that Morgan has to go up against, and don't worry if you don't remember all the details, because the movie constantly pipes in Neil's lines as voiceover when the assassins appear, just to give you that reminder, because it doesn't trust you to actually remember anything that's happening on screen. He effectively serves as a mentor figure for Morgan, but the way the role is written is nonsensical. He withholds information for seemingly no other reason than to just apply plot twists for later in the movie. There's a moment where Morgan warns him that all the assassins have links to each other and they link back to him as well, so whoever put these hits out is very likely coming after him as well. And I think this is meant to be a big emotional moment, but it's so grossly unearned, and Golding and Neil, in a particularly baffling moment, start crying in each other's arms, and I started pondering if the two actors were drunk just to get themselves through the scene. And even though Caldwell has been warned that someone is likely to kill him, he makes no effort to leave the big massive mansion that he lives in, one that's previously been established as having massive security holes, because Morgan sneaks in on several occasions undetected and surprises him, which is meant to be a running gag. Basically, he does nothing, and oh no, the entirely preventable thing happens. And when Neil leaves the movie about an hour in, that's about the point where any remaining shreds of dignity largely leave with him. The only other person that largely escapes with their dignity is Daniela Melchior, who's a bit of a rising star at the moment after a breakout role in the Suicide Squad as Ratcatcher 2, having now appeared in Guardians of the Galaxy 3, Fast X, and the forthcoming Roadhouse remake, which means she can leave this behind as an easily forgettable blip on her CV. And this is a really thankless damsel role. She's effectively called upon to look pretty and be endangered. That's about it. She's a teacher who's dating Morgan and believes that he's a photojournalist, but is rather suspicious about the fact that every time he comes back from travelling, his body is filled with bumps and bruises, which, I don't know, might be a little bit of a red flag. The character is consistently written to be so oblivious to the point of cluelessness, and the moment where Morgan actually reveals his identity as an assassin, she seems remarkably forgiving. Admittedly, he does kind of softball it, I am a professional murderer, but I kill the bad people. Nevertheless, Melchior is relieved of having to appear in too much of this movie because Morgan tells her to get out of the country, so there are great swaths of the film where the character completely disappears and only reappears late into the second half of the movie. So effectively, Melchior isn't really around for much of the worst of it, except for the climax, which is appalling. But this is an action flick. What's the action like? Absolutely atrocious. And Delamar can shoulder some of the blame for that too, because he's also one of the film's credited editors in addition to being its director. And when I pointed out his CV earlier, you might recall that he worked extensively for EuropaCorp. If you remember those action films, it feels exactly like one of those, which in 2023, in the modern action landscape, feels hopelessly out of date. It feels like movies from a decade ago that were trying to copy the Bourne template of having really close-up angles and shaky cam, which honestly only Paul Greengrass could actually do effectively, and resulted in loads of illegible fight scenes, which is precisely what happens in this film. I'd actually forgotten how bad this style of action movie making was because it's been so long since I've seen an example of it. It effectively died around 2014-2015 at the point where everyone took the piss out of Liam Neeson requiring 14 cuts to hop over a fence. No one is feeling nostalgic for that kind of filmmaking, which almost killed the genre a decade ago. Henry Golding could be a good action star, he could be in good physical shape, but I genuinely can't tell because the movie looks like it's been edited through a hedge trimmer. Every single fight scene is shot with zoomed in lenses that is way too closely action and cut every single nanosecond, so you can barely process what is happening on screen. Thank goodness for movies like The Raid and John Wick for actually teaching Hollywood how to do fight scenes again by just pulling the camera back and allowing the audience to see the choreography. It's just that simple. But Assassin's Club is edited like it's trying to turn a 6-year-old Liam Neeson into a badass instead of a 35-year-old Henry Golding who could probably handle the choreography. And then, as if that wasn't overstimulating enough, the movie has this near constant soundtrack that sounds like you're at a rave. There's pounding bass line, especially in the fight sequences. Oh, and then they zhuzh it up with stock stinger sound effects like it's a movie trailer. Swing! Swing! And the result, cumulatively, of the editing, the music, and the sound effects made me feel like I was having my head repeatedly slammed into a table. And it's not just the action scenes, sometimes the dialogue scenes are edited like that. There's an early scene where Rapaz is delivering a presentation to her fellow police officers, and it's cutting every half line of dialogue around this room, and it's so rapid. I'm sat there going, oh man, I really wish the rest of the movie isn't edited like this because I'm getting a headache. I'm getting disorientated. And it does quiet down, but for a lot of it, I was just going, oh my god, stop cutting to disguise the fact that you are aware your movie is boring, because it doesn't fix anything, it just makes it even more obnoxious on top. And that's not even getting into the glaring technical errors, like every time while the hitmen have to kill one, they have to sever a finger as a proof of death, which means we have the most laughably unconvincing severed finger props you have ever seen. They're so cheap and rubbery, it looks like the production just ran down to the local joke shop. And you know what I should really do with props that are that poor? You should put them in absolutely extreme close-up so no one could possibly miss how bad they look, and at points I actually thought I could spot rubber seam lines on the sides of the props. And some of the effects are practical, but most of the CGI is really wonky and at points seems to be unfinished. There's a moment where Henry Golding pulls out some flares, and for some reason in the first shot it's really poorly composited CGI flares, but perhaps the most risible moment of that is the big confrontation between Neil and Rapaz's characters where they're sat in front of a fireplace, which for some reason is a CGI fire. Why do we need a CGI fireplace? And it's really distracting as it moves at a visibly lower frame rate in the background. It looks like a looping GIF. Oh, and I had to spend a few moments talking about the absurdity of the film's finale. You've no doubt seen an action film with a bomb that has a countdown to explode. Well, this might be the first one I've ever seen that has a bomb with a countdown to diffusion. Yeah, I can't say I've ever seen that one before. Kudos for subverting my expectations. So Sophie gets predictably kidnapped by Fogg in Morgan's apartment, and she gets tied down to the bottom of a bathtub which is rapidly filling with water. This is a trap for Morgan, who comes in guns blazing but inadvertently steps over a tripwire, and that means that Fogg can cacklingly explain that the bomb that it's attached to, if he breaks through the tripwire, he ends up detonating the bomb instantly. But if he stands there without breaking the tripwire and the timer runs out, that means the bomb will defuse. But unfortunately, the timer is set so that it defuses after the point where Sophie will drown in the bathtub, and Fogg is just standing there explaining this laughingly, this expert master plan of hers, and I'm sat there going, well, if you went to all that effort, why didn't you just put a regular bomb in there, have him step over the tripwire, and you'll be like miles away when it explodes and kills the both of them? This is such an absurdly convoluted and preposterous scenario that it's not in any way tense, it's just absolutely laughable. Even Bond villains would go, that's an indirect way of trying to kill someone. And of course, it doesn't work. And then we get perhaps one of the worst CGI bullets into camera shots I think I have ever seen in anything. And just when you think you might be catching your breath with the credits in sight, just beforehand, the movie has the unbelievable optimism of teasing for a sequel. I don't think so. Assassin's Club is probably the worst theatrically released action movie I've seen in years. Yes, I have seen worse action movies, but they certainly weren't made to this kind of scale with this kind of resources, and they weren't playing in cinemas. In fact, the fact that this was released at the same time as a John Wick sequel is frankly an insult. And clearly, I wasn't alone in that opinion, because a couple in my my screening actually walked out with a whole hour of the movie to go because they couldn't stand any more of it, and the person sat in front of me was fidgeting even more than I was, apparently just grimly determined to just get to the end of it. And after my screening, we both walked out, and he actually asked me, was that as bad as I thought it was? And I confirmed, yes. In fact, it probably is even worse. And even though I had never met this person in my life, this was a complete stranger, for the next 5 minutes as we walked out of the cinema together, we were friends because we'd gone through this horrendous shared experience together. We'd somehow end up in an afternoon screening of Assassin's Club. We spent 2 hours watching this, of all movies. And honestly, I kind of wish that I got his name or his number to keep in touch, because this probably could have been the start of a beautiful friendship. I mean, say this about the movie, it certainly brings people together, and isn't that exactly what cinema's for?
You've probably seen this swish thing in the background of the entire video. This is a movie palette. It takes the colour tone of an entire movie and turns it into this artwork. So each of these lines represents a scene or sequences from the entire movie. In this case, this is Terminator 2 Judgment Day. And if you would like a movie palette of your own, then you can go to moviepalette.com and use the code FilmBrain15 to get 15% off your order. And thanks again to Movie Palette for sponsoring this video.
If you like this review and you want to support my work, you can give me a tip at my Ko-fi page, or with YouTube's Super Thanks feature, which is right below the video, or you can buy some of my merch from my TeePublic page, or you can hit me up at my Patreon, where you can see my videos early among other perks, including access to my Discord server. But until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.